air pollution in Nepal. In fact, there's a paper by Dr. Esther Duflo in 2008, where she expresses a surprise that economists haven't paid attention to the air pollution problem in the South Asia region. And this is where my dissertation comes in. So policymakers face the challenge of improving air quality throughout the world. And cost-benefit analysis certainly helps with designing several kinds of air quality improvement policies. But the challenge is really quantifying the total benefit of air quality improvement. So in literature, there are several approaches that are used to sort of like to estimate the total value of air quality improvement. So there are indirect approaches such as taking cost of illnesses, expenditure on self-protection measures, for example, the expenditure on masks, expenditure on air filters, and then there's hedonic pricing. So looking at the change in housing prices based on the improvement in air, clean air. And then there's also direct approach, stated preference approach, one of which is contingent valuation method. So it's a direct method of asking people how much they're willing to pay. We sort of like captures the total value people perceive from clean air. So in terms of literature, literature can be broadly defined, broadly sort of like put into two categories. So first one looks at the change in air quality. So air quality is sort of like taken as a metric for valuation. So the paper by Carlson and Johnson Stenman, a very highly cited work, looks at 50% air quality improvement in Sweden and finds that people are willing to pay on average $220 per year. And another study in Poland finds that people are willing to pay $133 and $153 for 25 and 50% change in air quality, respectively. We saw like accounts 0.5 to 0.7% of the annual income. And then younger individuals with high income and education are more likely to pay. And then another study by China finds that more than 80% of the people reported positive willingness to pay. So like we saw like suggests the strong public demand for air quality in China in recent period. And then there's a second strand of literature, like the argument started by Albertini and Krupnik, which says people are not able to sort of like understand the change in air quality, especially in areas where there's no air quality monitoring or sparse data. People are not able to relate to air quality changes. So what we have to do is we have to sort of like use health as a metric, air pollution related health as a metric of valuation. So this paper in 2000 sort of looks, so takes the scenario of avoiding illness, like the most recently experienced in Taiwan. Similarly, another study conducted in Cameroon, so that takes the 25% reduction in air pollution related morbidity and finds that people are willing to pay 0.2% of the annual income for 25 reduction in morbidity. Similarly, another study, so taking the data from 5 different countries, finds that people are willing to pay 330 euro for 50% overall gain in health. And then we sort of like follow the second strand of literature, we sort of like taking the health metric. So in our study, so we rely on the continuous evaluation method to elicit public willingness to pay. And we're also interested in identifying factors that influence willingness to pay decisions. So we take the scenario of a program that reduces air quality to the level that decreases the chance of air pollution related sicknesses by 50%. We're particularly interested in examining the impacts of individual exposure on willingness to pay. So for individual exposure, we sort of like consider the residential exposure, also the occupational exposure, but also people's this avoidance behaviors. How do people sort of like who are currently avoiding air pollution through using masks or filters? So how do they sort of like what do their willingness to pay look like? And then given their exposure, we're also interested in looking at the influence of awareness about the impacts of air pollution, how that affects people's willingness to pay decision. So in terms of the contribution to the literature, so we're the first CV study on public willingness to pay for air quality improvement in Nepal. There's previously a study by Adhikari, which is a Sandy working paper in 2012. So it looks like it estimates the cost of illness, but in terms of the continued evaluation, we are the first one. And in terms of the broader literature, we are the first CV study on air quality improvement to employ spatial econometrics. So which is sort of like our contribution to the broader literature. And then there have been other studies, previous studies that have used spatial econometrics in the context of cost of illness and hedonic pricing, but we are the first one to do for contingent valuation. So we took a primary survey of 610 random sample households from Siddharthnagar municipality, Nepal. And this was a survey conducted in summer of 2019. And then we followed the CV guidelines recommended by the NOAA panel, which are taking personal interviews to reduce non-response and hypothetical biases, presentation of the scenario, the good to be valued, proposed bid amount, and then the budgetary constraint to the households. And then we first conducted the focus group discussion, followed by training sessions for the enumerator, and a pre-test survey on 64 households before carrying the final survey. So that to ensure that we have a very cogent CV survey. And then we used a double-bounded dichotomous choice format, which, as discussed in Hahnemann's paper, has a statistical advantage because it sort of like, has sort of like provides more information about the bits. So a little bit more about the double-bounded dichotomous choice. So we first asked people if they're willing to pay one of the 6 randomly assigned bid amounts. So the amounts were 100 rupees, 300 rupees, 700 rupees, 1200, 2000, and 3000. And these bids were determined after the focus group discussion and then the pre-test survey on 64 households. So we first asked them to, so like the willingness to pay, if they were willing to pay one of the 6 amounts. And if they say yes, then we followed up with like doubling the amount and asking them if they're willing to pay the amount or not. If they said no to the first bid, then we halved the first bid and asked them again if they're willing to pay half for the first bid amount. And if this consistently said no to both the questions, we asked them the reason for why they're not willing to pay. So in our sample, 76% said yes to at least one of the 2 bids, and 26.6% of the respondents said yes to both the bids. So 76% are like indication of this strong public demand for air quality improvement in the study area. So, so the explanatory variables that we're interested in, residential exposure, which will we take proximity to Brooklyn, and then the ward level data on the road, so the road area in the ward. So it sort of like captures the traffic exposure. In terms of occupational exposure, we're interested in people who work outdoors. So we're interested in laborers, daily wage laborers, and farmers. And then composite prevention measures people. So we take 3 kinds of measures that people take to avoid the exposure. So one is use of face mask. The other is clean cooking stoves, and then the other is use of air filters. And then the next is awareness. So we ask people how aware they are that air pollution can have health and socioeconomic consequences on a scale of 1 to 3. And then so I think 81% of the people reported that they're either somewhat aware or completely aware about these consequences. And then our other control variables are how the residence duration of the households in the municipality, their wealth index, the education of the household wealth, age of the respondents, and then whether the respondent is male or female. So we start with our empirical strategy. We start with the double-bounded dichotomous choice model. So willingness to pay is expressed as a function of your residential exposure, your occupational exposure, whether you currently avoid this exposure, your current level of exposure, and then your awareness level, and then the control variables. And then, so one of the problem with often like talked about in the literature about the CV method is the hypothetical bias. And one of the ways to control for it, as discussed in the literature, is to controlling for the choice uncertainty. So in our study, so we take the asymmetric approach as defined in Champ et al. 2019. So after the willingness to pay question, we ask people how certain are they about the willingness to pay choices. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not certain at all, 5 being completely certain. So we are only taking willingness to pay responses as certain as definite willingness to pay responses if the certainties are either 4 or 5. So we record all the willingness to pay. If someone said yes to willingness to pay and reported they are not certain, then that response is recorded at 0. And as robustness, we also try the symmetric approaches that rescale the probabilities of yes and no, as discussed in Loomis and Estrand, and then this other paper in 2011. And also the other problem with CV design is that many people protest, these questions. So they may see value in clean air, but they respond. So for example, their response is like, I value clean air, but I don't feel responsible for it. Or government should take should be completely should be completely responsible for the cost. So these kind of responses are called protest responses. And what they do is they bias down your willingness to pay estimate. So a discussion in the literature, the one way to control for these protest responses is by dropping them. And in our sample, we find that 9% of the samples, they exhibit protest responses. But if we drop these responses, the other problem is that we may actually be succumbing to selection bias. So what we do is we also do analysis without dropping these protest responses. And then one step forward, we also conducted a Heckman selectivity model. And then there's also like a growing literature, stated preference literature, that are sort of like looking at the spatial patterns of the willingness to pay responses. And then this paper by Loomis and Mueller looks at the protection of spotted owl. The other paper looks at the forest management. And identification of such clusters can help in effective environmental management design. In the context of willingness to pay, as I discussed earlier, the paper exists on hedonic pricing and the cost of illness. And all these papers find that there's a very strong spatial correlation of the willingness to pay responses. So this is a table from our data. So we show that the bid amount, as expressed by the Moranjai statistics, the bid amount was randomly assigned in the study area, which we wanted to do and which we managed to achieve. But then if you look at the willingness to responses, what we see is that these willingness to pay decisions are not spatially random. I think they're spatially clustered in certain areas. So this gives an indication that we should be, the spatial econometrics model are appropriate in this case.
About 2 minutes left. Yeah.
So we do a spatial error model. So where the spatial dependence is through the error term. So we have many regression results in our table, but then I'm only showing results from our main two models. So what we see here is that people who are residentially exposed to higher air pollution, they're more likely to pay. So both bricklanes and people who live in high road area, they're significantly more likely to pay. Whereas these laborers and farmers who are like occupationally exposed, they are less likely to pay. Similarly, people who are more aware, they are more likely to express higher willingness to pay. So in terms of the HOTSPOT analysis, I see that higher willingness to pay is especially sort of like clustered. The high willingness to pay values are sort of like in areas where there's presence of bricklanes in the area. So if you look at Ward 1 and 4, this is where the bricklanes are located in the municipality. This is exactly where we see high values of willingness to pay. And if I compare it with my lung function measurement, which comes from my first chapter of my dissertation, I see a very strong correlation between lung function and willingness to pay, as in where people are affected the most, they're highly likely to pay. So discussion is that there's substantial public demand for clean air. Even in a small city like Siddharth Nagar, people expressed high willingness to pay, 76%. We estimate a mean value of 774 rupees, which is roughly 0.43% of the annual household income. And these are comparable estimates from other recent studies in terms of the percentage of household income. All the studies, usually the willingness to pay is between 0 and 1%. And then we find that this is heterogeneously determined, residential exposure being a primary one. So people display a not in my packet attitude, and outdoor workers are significantly less likely to pay. And then we find that, they report that affordability is the main issue for these outdoor workers because of it, they're not willing to pay. And then the significant policy influence of positive influence of public awareness on air pollution. So in terms of policy implications, so we draw policymakers' attention towards the rising public demand for clean air in Nepal. So we provide an estimate of public willingness to pay, and we also identify factors or areas where people are, highly willing to pay. And then for people who are not willing to pay, we also discuss, the reasons why they're not willing to pay. And then so in terms of the broader policy implication, we can increase awareness about air pollution to increase individual action, as seen in this study. So there's an importance to bridge the gap between research, policy awareness, and policy consideration. The government should look towards organizing awareness workshops in the community. Air pollution toolkits can also be taught at schools. So there's so much to be done about air pollution in Nepal. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Mohammad Mashiur Rahman, was my partner in crime in Nepal while conducting the survey, Nepal Study Center, Pratima Nima Memorial Foundation, all the enumerators and field supervisors, Sandy for funding this research, and atmospheric program at ECMOD for hosting my dissertation. Thank you so much.
Nice work, Niraj. Any questions for Niraj? Looks like you did a good job, Niraj. Nobody has question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. So it looks like we don't have, do we have our second presenter, Arjun or Babu? Since we don't have second presenter, let's go with Ben. Hello? Ben, are you there?
Hello? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yep. Just share my screen. Okay, you can see everything okay?
Yeah, it looks like you are okay, Ben.
Is the screen sharing?
Yes, screen is shared.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Alrighty, so my name's Ben Wilkins. I was lucky enough to do my research in Nepal in 2018. It was for my master's degree at Otago. So my title was an interdisciplinary approach to understanding water resources in the Jhikhu Khola catchment, Nepal. And it's about understanding water in this catchment through water quality sampling and interviews that I did. I did my interviews, my research, through the University of Otago, and also worked with other places such as ICIMOD. And I'd previously done research on water resources and land management in this area about 15 years ago.
Hey, Ben, do you have...
Okay, so here's a kind of photo of the Jhikhu Khola catchment. It's a very interesting place that has many drivers of change.
Your slides are on the first page, still on the first page. It doesn't show.
Okay.
And can you increase your volume too, if you have?
I'll try speaking a bit louder.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You can't see you can't see the second slide.
No, we haven't seen. Yeah, this is still on the first page.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can see.
Okay. But it's in the different view, or is it? Okay, I'll just keep going. So the Jhikhu Khola catchment is a very interesting place that has many drivers of change acting on it. It's located to the east of Kathmandu and is just outside the Kathmandu basin. You can see in the picture that there is an intensive agriculture on the valley floor adjacent to the Jhikhu Khola, which is the river flowing through the valley. However, further away from a reliable source of water, such as on the hills, it is not suitable for high intensity agriculture. The farmers there grow cash crops with 3 or 4 rotations per year, and there are strong market connections to Kathmandu through the Araniko Highway. Through climate change, there are longer dry spells and more intense rainfall events occurring. This results in too much rain for a short period of time and not enough for most of the year. You can see that there are some houses on the valley floor. So there is a balance between agriculture, urban areas and their resource demands. The lower catchment area near the highway is a peri-urban area that is growing rapidly. So you can imagine that water is at the center of these changes and is increasingly under pressure. Hopefully you can see this slide. So yep. So that's a more detailed map showing the location of the catchment, and you can see the Eraniku Highway in white running through the middle. Okay. So the aim of my study was to find out the state of water resources in the Jhikhu Khola catchment and how they are managed. And the aim was initially quite simple because I was unsure what I was going to find. You know, I usually live in New Zealand, so I hadn't been there before. And to a lesser extent, I was also interested in how to combine my interdisciplinary data. Water quality measurements and interviews can be complementary, but the two data types are quite different. So for my methods, I took about 450 water quality samples, which included things like metals, bacteria, nutrients such as nitrate and sediment. Some were measured at Kathmandu University in Dulakau, and others I brought back to New Zealand. I took the samples in March and April, which is in the dry season, and I also did semi-structured interviews with water users and experts with the help of a research assistant. Okay. So kind of to show my results, I'll show you a few pictures. That probably makes it easier to understand. So this is the top of the catchment where there is terraced agriculture. It's irrigated by a series of canals. This is the mid-catchment area. So this is where the most intensive agriculture occurs, and the farmers are growing many different vegetables, which they sell. At this time of year, it's mainly potato. Away from the Jhikhu Khola and the canals, you can see how dry it gets.
Hey, Ben, is it possible to increase your volume? It looks like few people might have difficulty on hearing.
Okay. Do you know if there's like a button that I can push to increase my volume?
I don't know.
Speak close to the mic and speak loud.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so this is a dam that diverts water into the canals. Each takes a fraction of the remaining water until there is not much left. So by the time the river reaches the highway, there is very little water left. A common theme from the interviews that I did was that water users don't have enough water in the lower reaches. You can also see in this picture that there are very large boulders and kind of some armoring on the sides. So during the monsoon season, you can see that there's probably a lot of water coming down this area. Yeah, and below the highway in the town, the river becomes a disconnected series of pools, and you can see that the current use of water does not provide a equitable amount for the lower riparian water users. Okay, so to summarize my findings, there are 5 distinct areas of water quality and water users. The upper catchment near the headwaters have abundant water and low contamination, which is marked by the blue. The river in the mid-catchment is progressively depleted from dams, and some areas are contaminated from farming practices. The land and access to water makes this the most profitable region. And the hill regions and Punchkau, which is the small town, rely on groundwater. They're further away from the river, but not everyone owns a well, So there is a water economy where people pay for water. The lower region is severely depleted or over-extracted, and so people are using groundwater for irrigation, which costs a lot more. Okay. So I've explained why there are a number of different factors, or how there are a number of different factors affecting water management. And these are listed on the right. So I chose to frame water as a common pool resource in the Jhikhu Khola catchment because there's a clear disadvantage to downstream users from the upstream abstraction, and additionally it is also difficult to prevent upstream extraction. The topics I focused on in my paper are the similar attributes that water quality has to water quantity in CPR literature, and we can see why it's undervalued when viewing it this way. Also that people moved to the catchment after the 2015 Gorkha earthquake, which we found out through our interviews, and that makes it more difficult to form lasting water management agreements. So these two factors are probably not the main cause of ineffective water management, but they are understudied aspects. So typically water quantity is thought of as the CPR. It's difficult to exclude use, and there is less utilization available to others after extraction. But water quality is undervalued because it prevents a significant proportion of water from being used. This might be because water quality is not always visible as the amount of water available. You know, you cannot always look at the water and say that it's drinkable, whereas you can most often see that water is not available. Many water users that were interviewed in the catchment only had one source of water and did not want to know if it was unsuitable to drink. Okay, so many people from the surrounding steep hill regions moved to the Jhikhu Khola after the 2015 earthquake, which is increasing the demand for water. People who move there also have less knowledge of the area and may be less inclined to participate in local water management, which is related to Ostrom's 8 rules for CPR governance. And this is an example of a long-term impact of the earthquake on resource management. So in summary, in the Jhikhu Khola catchment, water quality and the long-term effects of the 2015 earthquake are understudied and undervalued aspects of water management. The upstream and downstream water users need to reach some agreement on managing water. Other areas have used payments for providing minimum flows to downstream regions. However, the downstream regions have been disadvantaged for a while and are likely to be unable to afford to pay. And the issues that I've found in the Jhikhu Khola catchment are likely to be found in other areas of the Middle Hills. And I think that's about it. So yeah, thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Any questions for Ben? There is one on chat that asks is, are there any local government initiative to treat water and manage the distribution?
Yep, they do have some kind of working with the local council and maybe some from ICIMOD. So there's kind of sanitation and hygiene initiatives to improve the water quality. We found that every site had bacterial contamination, and so that's something to improve. And yeah, in other ways they were kind of managing their crop practices, so how they were farming to reduce overuse of fertilizers and pesticides.
Okay. Is there any other questions for Ben or even to Niraj? It looks like we don't have any other questions. That means we're ending early, I guess. So we can probably join other chat room or, oh, Vision sent a question to Niraj. Are there any initiative in Nepal, Siddharthanagar or Kathmandu or elsewhere to reduce air pollution? Any legislative push or other projects, Niraj?
Yes, I've already addressed that in the comments section, chat box, but then I can reshare that. So there are several major sources of air pollution in the region, Bricklin being one of them. Currently, around 1 lakh of these bricklins exist, in this Hindu Kush Himalayan region, and then also the Indo-Gangetic plain, because this plain, almost 2 billion people live in this particular region. So there's this rising demand for bricks. So bricklins are operating in this region, and then they're a major source of air pollution. For example, in Kathmandu, around 10 to 15% of the pollution is sort of explained by the emissions from bricklins. So there has been a push from the government to sort of increase either the current method of this bricklins. For example, there's this zigzag method, which is sort of trying to limit the emissions from these bricklins. And there's also push towards better technology used in these bricklins. Similarly, the several municipalities and also these gram palikas, which are sort of trying to subsidize these cleaner cooking stoves. For example, there's this case of Om Satya, this VDC, which is very close to Siddharthanagar municipality, and they were the policymakers were sort of subsidizing the gas stoves for them. But there was a report that sort of came out during this pandemic that because the supply chain was disrupted during that period, people went back to going to this traditional, way of cooking with fires and then mud stove. And then also there's government has been trying to tighten their, this vehicular standards. For example, in India, there's also this Vara standards, Vara Standard 6, which is already being implemented from April of 2021. So Nepal has been following closely with India. And then there's also been this tightening of these vehicular emissions. And also the Nepalese government, I think this is sort of an initiative that started in 2007. So they've been charging 50 paisa, so 0.5 rupees for every diesel and what diesel and petrol. So I was reading the report from last year, and then nearly 4 arba, I don't know how to say it in English, but 4 billion liters of diesel and petrol were imported to Nepal. So which means that if 4 billion come to Nepal, then 2 arab is collected as pollution tax. So this is something that's been happening in Nepal since 2007. And then the government has also been trying to restrict this biennial practice of, restricting crop residue burning, especially in Tara area, which is also another massive source of air pollution in the region. So there have been several initiatives, but again, the problem is, with this policy, how strict are these policies, and are they able to strictly, adhere to these policies? Are people strictly adhering to these policies? So there's still several challenges that we must overcome to limit air pollution in the region and in Nepal.